Okay, in this video, I'm going to be covering the negotiation skills component of the conflict resolution and alternative dispute resolution training workshops that I run. It's predominantly focused on staff and companies, I guess, working within the construction sector, but a lot of the different tools and skills that I talk about in the training are actually from other areas too. So I suppose predominantly I'm doing this video because there's been a number of clients request an online version of it. But even if you're not in that specific sector, you still might find that there are different bits and pieces that are useful. So as we think about negotiation skills, a negotiation, I should say, the first thing that we need to consider are the different layers that are involved in any particular type of negotiation that we're dealing with. Of course, at the surface, there will be elements of power. If I'm negotiating salary with my boss, there's obviously an imbalance of power there. My boss has a higher level of options to punish me or reward me. So arguably, they might have the upper hand in a negotiation. But power also depends on other things as well. If I have a unique skill set, like a particular type of credential that my boss really needs to run the business, then of course I'm standing on much more solid ground when I go in to negotiate something like my salary. It could be knowledge that we have, like inside knowledge about a particular process, etc. It might be to do with the network that we have and the relationships that we've built. It might be to do with the unique part that we play within a team in amongst all of the other unique team members and individuals that we're dealing with. Maybe there's something that we offer that somebody else doesn't. And so that would be an example when I'm dealing with my boss, but we can think about other types of negotiation in other relationships in a similar kind of way. If I'm negotiating with a contractor, for example, like I'm a construction company and I'm hiring a subcontractor to do some concreting or scaffolding or whatever else it is that I need, well, I guess that's also a situation where power might be the most obvious layer that we would consider. When there's a situation in the market where there's a real labor shortage, then of course the contractor has a lot more power in that situation because I don't have many other options. There's not many other people who can do the work. Or on the other hand, if there's a situation where there's a lot of labor coming through, maybe the government's had an initiative and trained up a whole bunch of people, or the inflation rates have meant that the level of construction has slowed down in the sector, for example, then all of a sudden the power dynamics might shift. And this is something that we need to pay attention to because it is something that changes over time. I think one of the mistakes that people sometimes make in a negotiation is that they assume that because something was this way last time round, then they only have that same option to follow here. So those examples where the labor environment changes and the contractor has more or less power and I have more or less power as a business owner trying to hire them, that's connected to this thing called BATNA. You can see on the screen there, BATNA. So what that stands for is Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. In other words, if I don't agree on a price and hire this particular subcontractor, where will that leave me? Like, what's my best alternative to dealing with this person? And if I've got a large panel of possible contractors that I use, obviously I have more power in that situation because I've got a much better plan B. There's a high likelihood that I'm going to be able to find someone to do the work that suits my needs. On the other hand, their BATNA can also change depending on how much work's going on in the sector at the moment, or their own level of networking, or their ability to forecast and project forward in terms of taking on future work, etc. So we need to consider those different elements, especially in terms of them changing over time, but also how we can influence it. Maybe reaching out to a couple of other contractors who do a similar kind of work might not be a bad option before you go in to call this person and ask them what the best price that they can do is for this job, because you know that that's going to give you much more sure footing to stand in terms of the negotiation itself. You could also think about the negotiation at the level of rights. Now, obviously, in many situations, there will be some type of formal rights involved. This might be the contract that's used in a subcontractor arrangement, for example. It might be job descriptions and employment contracts. It might be the obligations of a tenant and a landlord and that kind of thing, or maybe obligations of local government or different levels of government to their constituents. So we've got the level of legal rights. What does the actual contract say? We've also got the level of like, what did you agree to? So what's in the email trails? What was the conversations? Where are the records of the meetings, etc.? And at this level, obviously, we'll be in a much stronger position to negotiate if we have as much what you might call evidence for those agreements as possible. That's why it's so important after a conversation with someone to just follow up with a quick email. It doesn't need to be, what would you say, inflammatory or adversarial, like I'm not poking a bear type of thing by confirming in writing. Of course, it might come across that way if I say something like, I just want to make sure you follow through with what we've agreed as below. I look forward to working with you, or something like that, or I trust that we'll have a good working relationship. All of this stuff, it's like adding pressure, adding a sense of what's at stake, adding a little bit of suspicion, adding a little bit of implied criticism. So we really want to lower the stakes when we're following through with that follow-up email. Just to confirm what we discussed this afternoon, this is what I understood from the conversation. Please let me know if I've got anything wrong. The last thing I would want is for us to be on different pages moving forward. We can also think, though, about things like socially accepted standards. These are the kind of non legal rights, non black and white, non evidence based types of rights. It's things like reciprocity. Maybe you have been generous with this client before and there's been a number of problems that you were able to fix without charging them anything extra. And this time round, because of this new problem that you're dealing with, or the new request that they're making for a variation mid-project or whatever else it might be, you've been generous before, you've tried to help them out. This time round, what you're asking is that they might be able to help you out in some sense too. Look, none of us could have anticipated the level of delay given all of the recent rain and flooding in the area. On our end, we're not expecting to be paid the full amount, and obviously there'll need to be some flexibility in terms of deadlines, etc. Would it be possible to organise a time to go through the additional costs that have been incurred throughout the project and maybe discuss options for mitigating these where possible, or covering these where possible, or how these could be shared between us, or how these will be dealt with moving forward? So it could be just, this is a topic that I want to discuss. And even if you're confirming something, it could be like, this is my take on the situation. Please let me know if you've got a different perspective. And in that sense, I suppose, we're not putting as much at stake. If we come in saying, you're always asking for stuff from me, this is ridiculous, it needs to be give and take, it's about time you started to give instead of just taking. I mean, obviously, that's going to invite a similar response from the other person, which is adversarial, often defensive, often justifying their own perspective and probably their past behaviors as well. It's like, from our perspective, it seems like we've been generous, we've given you the benefit of the doubt, we've covered these costs. I don't know, maybe there's other factors on your end that we're not even aware of, but from where we sit, it might be fair that in this case there is some financial contribution from yourself, but what do you make of that? Like, obviously, people are going to use tactics to avoid paying where possible, but there's a lot of research showing that referring to words like fair, for example, in a negotiation, really works because people want to be seen as being fair. So asking someone something like, I'm sorry, I'm just not sure how this seems fair from your perspective, given the fact that this is the amount of money that we've had to spend and this is your relatively smaller amount by comparison, or you're the principal contractor and we're the subcontractor here. I'm just not sure how it seems fair that we're bearing the entire amount of risk involved here. So equality, seniority, obviously we have a level of expertise here. Would it be possible to go with our decision, etc.? Precedent, maybe they've followed through with you before and it's worked out well, so maybe you're asking them to do the same thing this time. Or the reciprocity, the give and take type of thing that I've talked about before. And then at the inner layer is the level of interests. This is where we start to think about what's important to both of us. Sometimes there's not much else other than that single negotiation that you're dealing with. It's effectively a fixed pie game. In other situations, we might be able to look at options for expanding the interests or meeting other interests aside from those that have initially been focused on. So if we think about it as a fixed pie type of negotiation, there's a pie and I'm going to get half and you're going to get half, or I'll get a third and you'll get 2/3 or something like that. That's what's called distributive negotiation. If we think about not a fixed pie type of arrangement, where instead of just the single issue that we're dealing with, we look at ways of expanding and looking at multiple issues and building that in, that's what's called integrative negotiation. So if we've got a contractor and they're asking for more money, maybe midway through the project, given the increased costs of materials or something like that, we could either approach it as a distributive negotiation or integrative. If we think about it as distributive negotiation, what we'll do is decide how assertive that we want to be. Sometimes, if they're very important to us, it's mid-project, we don't want to upset them too much. We might just give in to keep them happy, agree that pay them a little bit more. There might be a limit that we put on it, like I just want to be clear that this won't necessarily be the arrangement moving forward. It's only for this bit of work and for this dates. We might also ask for something in return, like I can't fully discount that, but I could meet you halfway, or some type of a compromise. Or if we cover the costs of the material, could you cover the costs of the labor? Or yeah, I understand you thought that we were providing the vacuum truck for this job. Look, we're willing to provide it, but would your guys be able to manage the work? So when we think about it as distributive negotiation, we're only talking about this job. It's the single issue of the money or the sucker truck or whatever else is needed. And we decide how assertive to be. Sometimes we take that soft bargaining type of approach, other times hard bargaining, sometimes it's meet in the middle. Now, when we think about negotiation in this way, obviously we're going to share information that conveys our bargaining strength and makes us seem stronger by comparison to the other side, which might be pointing out their mistakes. Like, you should have thought of this. It was in your original quote. What's going on? And we might even add a little bit of pressure or personal attack. Do you guys even know what you're doing at all? Like these types of little comments, and adding in a little bit of relationship conflict, if you can remember from the earlier module in the course. So we pressure them, we look for ways to unsettle them. In terms of the issue itself, we're wanting to make ourselves seem as, I guess, distant and unpressured as possible. If you show up to buy something on Facebook Marketplace, like I really like guitars, so when I show up to buy a guitar, the very first thing I often say is, oh, I don't like it very much, or oh, it's a bit older than I expected, or oh, don't you have a case for it? You want to point out some negative things, because what I'm wanting to do is to subtly influence the situation to seem like their proposal is too high, and actually a fair amount would be something lower when I'm the buyer. Of course, when I'm the seller, I immediately point out, like, I haven't seen any of these actually on Facebook since I've listed it, so they must be reasonably rare. Like, I'm starting to talk to them about fear of missing out or something like that, right? So whatever side of the fence we are, that distributive negotiation process often looks like trying to win. It is, I guess, to some extent adversarial. We want to learn about the other side. We want to use a tactic like anchoring, where we put in a strong first offer if we're buying, or a strong first offer if we're selling, I guess, a really low price, or if we're buying, a really high price if we're selling. And we're wanting to negotiate down from that, but that initial price is like, the recommended retail price that you'd often see in shops, like was $50, now $25. What a massive bargain that must be, right? The other way to think about the negotiation, though, as I mentioned, is what's called integrative negotiation. This is where, instead of just focusing on the single issue and the single point around it, we look at ways of expanding the pie. So if we have a contractor wanting to negotiate price around this particular project, we might look at other things that are connected to it. Like maybe they can do some additional preparation work for you, or you could keep the same price but provide some laborers for them, for example, or be more flexible in terms of the timeframes, even though you're not willing to expand the price. Or maybe there's something else, like another project that you've got coming up. So instead of just negotiating about this smaller bit of work, you're both negotiating about a larger amount of work, which obviously would have more value to both of you, and therefore, as a result, it's more likely that there's some flexibility in the costings. So this is a different approach. We look at other factors that are connected, and it's not necessarily the case that one of these is better or worse or right or wrong. It's really case by case. But when we're looking at an ongoing relationship where the results of this negotiation depend on another one, and there's enough at stake to warrant the time and the effort and the resources invested, then integrative negotiation is likely to get to the better result. Distributive negotiation has a little bit more risk of negatively impacting the relationship. Like you might win, so to speak, that they agree to do the work at the lower cost, but maybe they are grumpy and, they find a way to get back at you later by putting in their next quote higher, or they do a dodgy bit of work midway through the project and they don't tell you because they feel hard done by or something like that, right? Whereas an integrative approach has more likelihood of getting to an actual win-win, although it takes longer, more time and effort needed, delays getting to an outcome, that kind of thing. So when we think about an effective negotiator, these are the types of things that they often manage to do. They separate the person from the problem. They think about this discussion or this issue as separate from the people involved, which is particularly challenging when the other side isn't doing that. I've talked to a number of construction companies recently, and part of the challenges that they've been dealing with is project managers or client representatives on the government side for government work, particularly local councils where they don't have the best project management processes in place. And they talk about things like having a young university graduate that's shown up or someone who's come from the private sector, and they've got a particular idea in their head about the way things should be done, and they're just not able to think outside the box, so to speak. And that can be very frustrating, and it's tempting to take that out on the other person, even just rolling your eyes when they make a negative comment or something like that. The issue here is that you have different perspectives about what's the best way forward. So if we think about that as the problem, immediately the options that we can consider are things like giving them information in a different way than we have previously, choosing a different forum to deliver the message, changing our perspective. Maybe we should reconsider our expectations. And if that's really what they want, even though it's not the ideal way to do it, maybe we should just give them a quote on that. Like all of a sudden we think about options to manage this problem of I'm dealing with someone who doesn't understand my perspective. And instead of me thinking you're a moron, instead it's like I haven't figured this out yet. They managed to focus the negotiation on interests, not just positions. Again, this might be challenging when you're dealing with the other party and they're just constantly throwing a proposal at you, like take it or leave it, best and final offer type of language. If we can shift the conversation towards interests, then we have more options. So I know that price is one of the most important factors for you. What are the other primary considerations in this upcoming project? So maybe there are other things like they can't have any delays because they've got a use of the building that's quite important as soon as it's finished. Or maybe for them it's the level of risk involved given the fact that there's dangerous chemicals or there's a high density residential area. There will be other factors that are more or less priority depending on the particular project. And as we're negotiating a particular factor of it, like, overcoming a problem that we're dealing with, if we can keep the conversation focused on interests, it increases the other person's level of buy-in. Like, for example, if we know that that local council has a particular value of environmental sustainability, that's their interest, then we could say something like, look, given the fact that this is one of the most environmentally sustainable types of material that we have available, you can let the local members of the public know that all of this work has been done as responsibly and ethically as possible. Like their interest is they want to look good for the members of the public. And what I'm saying to them is, if you choose this method or this model, this product, which by the way I happen to sell, you would look good to the people that are involved. You would look good to your boss. You would, all this kind of thing. The third thing is to consider options. So what we want to do is almost look for opportunities during the negotiation to establish a bit of a brainstorming. Sure, that's one option. We could do it like that. Have you been considering other ideas as well? Or what led to that decision? When you haven't gone with this option previously, what other types of techniques might work as well? When you've talked about having it finished by November, how much flexibility is there in terms of those timeframes? Would it be the beginning of November or the end? Does that make any difference from your perspective? What we're wanting to do is to just brainstorm, and as many options as we can get together can be helpful. Then in some situations, there's a particular criteria that we can use. We could refer to it like an Australian standard or something like that, or the fact that a local council has advertised wanting to offer work to Indigenous companies, for example, or not-for-profits and social enterprises, or maybe there's some particular value that they've got that they've publicly said, and then you can use that as a criteria to say, I know that's important to you, so this would be an option that matches that. What do you think? I kind of assume, or this might be a good way forward. How does that sit with you, type of thing? And then the final thing that we can use is this idea of BATNA that I mentioned earlier. And you can see the diagram on the screen here explains how this works. Up the top, we might have somebody who is the buyer, so the buyer of labor. Maybe if you're hiring a subcontractor to do some work for you, you would be up the top of the line. And then down the bottom would be the seller. This would be the subcontracting company or individual. On the other hand, when you are dealing with a client directly, the client's up the top and you are down the bottom. So when you're dealing with clients, a lot of the time they might have a number in their head for the work that's done. That's what's called the aspiration point. Now, that's not often connected to reality. It might just be what their friend has told them they built their house for up the road, or it might be the amount of money that the bank has agreed to lend them or something like that. It's usually not anchored in anything firm, which means that they might be willing to pay more and they might be willing to pay more for the same work to be done, but they will hit a reservation point right at their BATNA. Their reservation point's connected to their BATNA, their best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Because if they've got 3 other builders who have offered them the same design of a house, then of course they're not going to choose yours that's 30% more. Or if a subcontractor has been offered work from a number of different companies at the moment and you're offering them the lower rate, then obviously they're not going to accept a higher rate from you, even if that's your aspiration point, that's what you've budgeted for and that kind of thing. So the client has their aspiration point, the buyer has their aspiration point, not really set in reality. On the other side, the seller often has their aspiration point not connected to reality. If you're dealing with a subcontractor, for example, they probably hope that you'll pay them, I don't know, double what you normally would. Like, why not? But that's not connected to any version of reality. It's usually connected to the jet ski that they want to buy, or the dirt bike they've got their eye on, or the divorce, or the fact that they've blown all their money on the pokies last pay, that kind of thing. They might be willing to take the work at lower money and at lower rate, but for them, the person selling, you, if you're dealing with a client or a subcontractor that you're hiring, their reservation point is connected to their BATNA. So some of the ways that we can use this is by doing some research about their BATNA, thinking carefully about ours, and maybe there are options that you can take to change that balance, expanding the different options that you've got, for example, doing some research about what other builders are quoting for similar kinds of work, talking to the client about the main factors that's involved, and aside from price, what else might be connected, that kind of thing. So, as we're going through a process of preparing for a negotiation, a lot of the time should actually be spent getting ready. And I know this is an incredible opportunity for a lot of companies in construction. Sometimes there's not much option. You get a tender and you apply for it. And I think sometimes, honestly, from the word go, it's just like best and final offer. They're not even willing to take on board any notes or make any possible changes at all. In other situations, though, there's a lot more flexibility, like discussing options for a variation, or maybe there is some room for negotiation around a particular bit of work that you're talking about with the potential client, or even a subcontracting arrangement with a tier one company. So, the first thing that we can do here is to assess the situation. I think this is the starting point, and a deliberate focus is needed. I've talked to a number of very large companies, like the kind of groups that do very large scale tier one construction, the big highway upgrades, the mine remediation work down in the Hunter Valley many times. And so often I hear things like, negotiation is one of the biggest opportunities for us. And when I say, how come, or could you tell me a bit more about that? Again and again, they say things like, because at the moment it's a bit of a dog's breakfast. They don't do it deliberately. They've got skilled people with a high level of expertise, but what happens is they get used to just doing it all off the top of their head. And instead of just doing that, if they instead took time to think through the factors, well, first of all, it would mean that they could be more confident that they're not leaving value on the table. But it also helps the junior staff to come through. So if succession planning and, training up some of your younger guys to develop skills in negotiation and communication, which by the way will supercharge their performance in the business and also their career, lower their levels of of stress, etc., then teaching them how to prepare for a negotiation might be something that's really useful. So we think about the situation, who are the stakeholders, who should be involved, who are the decision makers, etc. What's the limit of their authority? Are there any conflict of interest? That kind of thing. What are the issues? What's the effective time? Sometimes, although it's tempting to get things resolved as soon as possible, you might not want to. In some situations, the longer that something sits there, the more pressure it puts on the other party. I know for me, there's been a few times I haven't responded to an email quickly just because I wanted the other person to have the sense that I'm busy and there's other things that I'm paying attention to at the moment, to let them know effectively that they don't have as much power over me as that they might think that they have. Are there other negotiations that depend on this one, and what rights and fairness norms should be applied, or what questions should be avoided? You then should think about the relationship. What's the potential for future work with this particular client? What's the history of the relationship with this particular contractor? Of course, it might be that you decide to follow a similar course of action that you've taken in the past, but in many situations, reviewing helps us to calibrate and make sure that we're responding effectively. So, what's the relationship? What's the likely future and next steps of the relationship? What's the level of trust? What are the personality types? What's their likely tactics? That kind of thing. And then we could think about our position, like as well as cost, what else is important to us? And what are the relevant priorities here? And how is this changing over time? Like we ideally want this money, but if we can't get that, this is what we want. Or in terms of money, this is what would be an absolute home run. This is something that's a pretty good option. This is our walk away point. Like we can live with it, and we would agree to it. But beyond that, that's something that we consider to be a bad deal. Like obviously, this is so much easier to think through when you've got a cool head rather than in the middle of a tense negotiation process, right? You would then think about their position. What's their BATNA? How are they likely to act? What's their interests? What are their likely reservation points and aspiration points? And this then all helps us to develop a flexible strategy. How should we frame issues in a way that's mutual and neutral, future focused? Like I'd like to find a type of fair outcome. I'm hoping that we can figure out a way to manage this situation that's fair to all of the parties that are involved. I'd like us to make sure that we're on the same page moving forward and to make sure that all of the expectations are clear, that kind of thing. On what issues will you compete and be firm, and on which issues will you be more soft? Where will you compromise and where will you collaborate? And how can trust and reciprocity be developed? And what types of tensions or, what would you say, like items or discussion points are likely to push people's buttons and set them off? So you can see how all of these bits and pieces fit together on the screen. If it's very important to us, then it makes much more sense to take a competing approach and to go in and be firm. If it's a situation where it's important to the other party, like meeting a particular deadline, for example, maybe then it's just all hands on deck to make sure that we do that and we take an accommodating approach. And that would be strategically sensible when it's an important client to us and there's a chance of future work, for example. In other situations where it's important to both of us, like there's been a problem with the work and we're asking a contractor to come in and fix it, of course that's challenging for them because they've already got other work going on at the moment, then we might think about options like compromise or collaborating. Like they can send a few stuff over and we provide some labor, or they do it on weekends, or they do it 2 weeks after the date, but we make sure at least that they're doing it. Or we agree to pay them some portion of it if they can come and do it quicker. Or maybe it's compromise, like we fix half of it and they fix the other thing, or we do a little bit of work and they just do the remainder. So you can kind of see, even in a single negotiation, there might be 4 different items, and 1 or 2 of them you might decide to take a more competing approach, and others are more accommodating, compromising, or collaborative. So I hope that that's been helpful for you, thinking about some of those options for the negotiation skills. It's normally the final module of the conflict resolution training and alternative dispute resolution training course that I run for the construction companies in New South Wales. So if you'd like information about that or any of the other conflict resolution types of workshops that I run, assertiveness skills, de-escalation, performance management, coaching skills for leaders, or self-regulation and burnout prevention, that kind of thing, please feel free to get in touch. Thanks very much for watching. All the best.